Hello everybody, by now you have watched the Stamp Act and Quartering Act video that I have embedded in the Google form for your written response. If not, make sure that you go back and watch those before you take these notes, okay? I'm making this video because I want you to be able to take some pen and paper if you've got it and handwrite these notes, okay? So the first notes that we're going to go over today, and as always, just to make sure that you're getting in the habit of it, make sure that you put your date at the top of your paper and also put your name. Okay. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So the first set of notes that we're going to go over here are the Stamp Act. Okay. So the Stamp Act we've talked about previously, and we know that the Stamp Act was passed in 1765 in order to raise money following the French and Indian War. So the Stamp Act was passed in order to raise money to pay back war debts caused by the French and Indian War. Okay. So the Stamp Act, it was a tax that was placed on all printed goods. Okay, passed on all printed goods. So, for example, you might have pamphlets, marriage license, newspapers, playing cards. If you had any of these things in the colonial times in colonial America during the Stamp Act, you would be getting taxed on each of those items. So the next line that we're going to put is that the Stamp Act was a tax on anything paper. Okay, so again, that's your playing cards. Okay, that's also going to be marriage licenses. It's going to also include other things such as pamphlets that you might pick up and newspapers. Okay. So the Stamp Act, it did anger the colonists, yes, because they didn't like having extra money taken out of their wallets, but it really bothered them mostly because it was an example of the British thinking that they could pass a tax without giving representation. Okay, so the main reason why this upset colonists is because the British thought they could pass a tax without any say from the colonists. Okay. And so I've told you guys in class before, we've talked about the example of if you went to go eat with your friends or if you went to go see a movie with your friends, and every single time that you wanted to give input on where you were going to go eat or what movie you were going to see, if every time they just completely ignored you and made the decision without you, you'd probably start to get pretty tired of it. And so this is kind of what we start to see with the colonists. Every time there's a decision made by British government, they never let the colonists be involved, and it's really starting to get on their nerves, similar to how it would get on your nerves if you're hanging out with your friends and they never let you pick the movie, they never let you pick where you're going to eat and different things like that. So colonists would try to resist the Stamp Act in many ways. Okay, so right here we're going to write down colonists' forms of resistance. Okay, there were many ways that they would try to resist the Stamp Act. Okay, one way is that they would boycott, which is where you refuse to buy something. They would boycott stamps. Also, they would burn British stamps. And also, another thing is they would start to bother tax collectors. Another thing to know, if you were a tax collector in colonial times, even though you were just trying to do your job, So there might have been some tax collectors that were just trying to do their job, but it was a very difficult job because you were not very well liked, and you could potentially end up getting bothered and getting, very poorly treated by these colonists. So another thing that we're going to write down is that some tax collectors even get attacked by the colonists. And then one last thing that we're going to write down is that these resistance groups would even stop buying any British products whatsoever. So not only were they starting to boycott the stamps, but there were some resistance groups such as the Daughters of Liberty who would encourage people to stop buying British clothing, and the Sons of Liberty were also organizing boycotts. So we start to see that the British are losing a lot of money. So there's another effect that comes out of the Stamp Act, okay, and it's something that King George is definitely not happy about. Another effect that comes from the Stamp Act is that many colonists from different colonies meet together to form the Stamp Act Congress. And this is important because it's an example of seeing the colonists sort of unite together behind King George's back to try and make decisions on whether or not this is actually fair not to be getting these taxes. So there are a lot of negative effects for King George that come out of the Stamp Act, and so ultimately this effect ends up causing Parliament, which is British government, it ends up causing Parliament and King George III to decide on repealing or taking back the Stamp Act. So by now, not only have you talked about or watched the videos about the Stamp Act, but you've also watched that video that I posted about the Quartering Act. And so that video is kind of showing you an example of what it might sort of look like for a colonist to be having to host a British redcoat in the middle of the colonial times. So when we say the Quartering Act, we're not talking about quarters as in change, right? We're talking about living quarters. So the Quartering Act was passed in 1765, and it was passed again by British Parliament. Again, British Parliament, that was their form of government, their lawmaking group. And this law stated that the British redcoats had a right to live in colonist houses whenever they needed to in colonial America. So I don't know about you guys, but I would not really like it if the government made a rule where military soldiers could just show up at your house in the middle of the night and demand a place to stay. Many colonists were upset about this because colonists felt as if this was a violation of their privacy. They didn't want people to be able to just show up in their house unannounced. Not only did you have to provide a bed for these British redcoats, but also British troops could sleep in your home, eat your food. Basically, you had to give them whatever they needed. And it was very frustrating for colonists to have to accommodate for British troops' needs. It's also important to note that colonists were not excited to have to host these British troops, and we know this. So oftentimes that would kind of filter into how they treated these British troops. So even though you're a British troop and you might be staying in somebody's home and getting to use some of their items if you needed to, it wasn't always a pleasant experience for you, because oftentimes colonists would treat the soldiers poorly. stayed in their home. Okay, so by now you guys have written all these notes and you have watched a couple videos and use this information um, as some help for you as you complete your written response. Try to use that peel method, and I hope that you have a wonderful day and enjoy the snow.